Hi everyone, I'm Shinru. I'm really happy and excited to moderate this event. And a little bit about myself. I graduated from CMU back in 2019 with a master's degree in artificial intelligence. And today we have our invited guest, Ankur Goyal. And so let's just get started. Hi, Ankur.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you? So,
I'm doing great.
yeah, thank you so much for doing this with us. Before we dig in, would you like to talk a little about yourself, your backstory, and tell us one of the hobby that you pick up during this COVID?
Yes, I can do that. Everyone, my name is Ankur. I think I've met a bunch of you before and really excited to chat with you all today. Uh, so I, um, as Shinru mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of a company called Impira. And before that, I worked at a company called MemSQL, which is now called Single Store, and was the VP of engineering there. And actually prior to that, I went to school at CMU and studied computer science undergrad. So we can talk about some of the career stuff in depth, but to jump into the COVID hobby, I've been really into coffee for almost like 10 years. And, I try beans from all over the world and different brewing methods and stuff. But over COVID, my fiance, Elena, and I visited a bunch of wineries in Napa and Sonoma. And I got just as into wine as I have been in coffee uh, for the past several years. So that was a lot of fun. We we actually never really went to Napa or Sonoma, even though it's in our backyard, basically. While we were here before that, because every time we would go on vacation, we wanted to travel on a plane somewhere. But we realized really how beautiful Northern California is and how much fun it is to go wine tasting. And we're both giant nerds, and so there's like an infinite amount of stuff you can learn about wine as well. And so what better way to spend COVID than outside in beautiful Northern California, drinking wine and asking a bunch of nerdy questions about it.
Well, that sounds really interesting. It's such an exploration.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with your career experiences. So what have led you to your current particular career position, and in your career experiences, what were your turning points that makes you makes you have the transitions from one place to another?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll start with CMU. I went to CMU in the fall of 2008, which probably makes me significantly older than the people on this call. And that was right actually at the peak of the recession, and tech wasn't super hot at that point. But I just loved math and had just started getting into computer science. And I didn't really know much about coding when I went to CMU, but I learned a lot really quickly. And my sophomore year, I took this class called operating systems, and I really just like fell in love with systems during that class. And the summer after, I interned at Microsoft, worked on some system stuff, and then I came back to CMU and just took like a bunch of math and systems classes. And the summer after that, actually, I went to San Francisco to intern at a startup. And I met a bunch of other startups in the process, and it just blew my mind. I realized after I met the founders of MemSQL that if I worked here, I would probably learn more about systems than if I went back to CMU. So I actually dropped out that summer and joined MemSQL as employee number 2. I think to a large extent I was right. Like it was kind of like operating systems on steroids, building a relational database, and I learned an insane amount really, really quickly. And at MemSQL, I would say my first turning point was taking operating systems. If any of you are in CMU still and you have an opportunity to take that class, I highly recommend it. Maybe you won't like it as much as I did, but it will certainly make you go deep in an area that you might really fall in love with. The second one was joining MemSQL, which was a tiny company, and I learned just an insane amount about startups, not only how to build, database software, but how to recruit engineers and how to work with all different kinds of people, and doing some sales stuff and marketing stuff and customers. And ultimately, I had the opportunity to grow into being the VP of engineering, and got to do that for the second half of my tenure there, which was 5.5 years. So I learned a lot in that role, and that really, I think, taught me the formative lessons, and kind of created some formative interest for me to go on to Impira. So I left MemSQL in December of 2016, and then took some time off. I immediately wanted to start a company. Actually, I didn't have any ideas, but I just couldn't imagine not working. But one of my good friends gave me the advice that the next time I'd have some time to take off, I might have kids, and I might be married, and so on. And so I might not actually be able to do the same kind of travel as I would now. So I took his advice, and my little brother had actually just graduated from college. And so we went to South America, and I went to Africa with another friend, and around Europe, and really, enjoyed myself, learned about a number of ideas and things that I hadn't thought about at MemSQL, and then came back in July of that year. And a few things happened. One, someone introduced me to my now fiance, and we met for coffee for the first time on July 7th in 2017. And then actually right after that coffee meeting, I had lunch with the folks at Lightspeed, which is a venture capital firm. And I had just started thinking about the idea of Impira, and actually built a demo with some of the safari pictures that I had taken the week before when I was in Kenya. And I showed them the demo, and they got really excited. And so the next week, I actually pitched at Lightspeed and a bunch of others, and then got some term sheets. And then the following Friday, I signed the term sheets with Lightspeed and General Catalyst, and that turned into our first round of funding back in 2017. And funny enough, I actually had dinner, my first dinner date with Alana that evening as well. And so these two things were just kind of happening at the same time. And I definitely had a really good July in 2017. So that's when we started, or I started, actually. It was just me at that point, Impira. And the next several months I spent trying to convince some of my friends and coworkers and so on to join, and got a few folks to join right around September of that year. And we started figuring out what to build. And we found a great use case, which was kind of like the safari picture thing that I built a few months ago, where lots of customers were having trouble sorting through mountains of unstructured data, specifically image and video content, and could use our technology, which at that point was kind of a combination of using computer vision to understand the content of images, and database-like infrastructure that let you search and query that information very efficiently. So we found our first few customers, and started working with them that summer. They're still customers today, and we've had the really good pleasure of growing with them, and working with them for a really long time, and evolving the software. But actually, the next year after that, as we were growing and selling and learning about the market, some of our customers started loading PDF documents into our product and asking, like, hey, you can understand what's in images, can you also read structured data out of these PDF documents? And we realized, actually, yes, we could do that with our technology, and that this was an even larger opportunity and bigger use case. And we realized that unlike searching for lots of images and videos, and I can go into why in a second, this use case is something that could be self-service as well, because an individual user could take advantage of it. And that was something that was exciting to us. So we started working on kind of retooling some of our technology to work really well for this use case. And then COVID came along. And like every startup, this is another turning point. Like every startup, including well-funded startups like us, we had raised another round by this point as well. We had to ask ourselves, like, we're doing all these different things. We're experimenting with this PDF thing. what should we really focus on, because we can't do too many things at once. And we were so excited by the PDF processing and reading structured data out of text use case that we decided to just put all of our resources into that use case. And so we spent a good chunk of last year actually really focused on advancing the product and building that use case. And we shipped a self-service version of our product later that year. And that's kind of been the fun of what we've been doing since then. We're now acquiring all of our new customers by people signing up online and playing with the product, and sometimes even putting it in production before they talk to us. And then, hopefully some of them come along and pay us as well. And so that's kind of been the evolution of Impira over the past couple of years.
That sounds interesting. I didn't know that you were a CMU dropout.
Yeah.
So it feels like you've been always have this spirit of entrepreneurships. You dropped out because you joined a startup in San Francisco and you found out you could learn much more there. And you also started your own startup after that.
Yeah, I would say I'm also very fortunate. I did immigrate to the US, but I was very fortunate, for example, to become a citizen when I was 18, and a number of other things that made the downside risk of taking a lot of these kind of crazy bets in my life a lot lower. But you're absolutely right. When I was dropping out or joining MemSQL or leaving MemSQL or starting Impira or thinking about pivoting and changing the company when COVID hit, among other things, I've always enjoyed the opportunity to do things that are a little bit more aggressive or off the beaten path if they can be valuable.
That's really amazing. And would you mind sharing some of your working style, your working schedules? How's it like to work as a startup in the early stage or working at your own startup? Are there any differences?
There can be. I think the main difference, even if you're an early employee versus being a founder, is that if you're a founder, and especially if you're a CEO, there's just a lot of stuff that no one wants to deal with, and it comes your way. A great example of that is paying taxes. I went to the post office probably like 10 times last year to pay taxes in different states that we now have employees in, where for some reason or another, we couldn't e-file our taxes. And so imagine like the task of having to spend, an hour printing 200 pages of paper during COVID, where like all the print shops are closed and you can't, no one can do that for you. So I had to go to FedEx, buy a printer and toner, install it in my apartment, print 200 pages of paper, which felt ridiculous, package it up, and then go to the post office and send it. And that's just like one small example of the kind of stuff that you have to do, I think, as a founder. But I think in many ways your career is how much you put into it. And I would say like working hours and intensity for me are pretty much the same at Impira as they were at MemSQL.
Okay, so as a CEO, do you still code?
That's a good question. Yeah. So, everyone is different, and I would say like my working style generally is to have my hands involved in a lot of different things at once, but go really deep into one or two things at a time. And sometimes that means going really deep in the product, and sometimes that means writing code that is on the critical path for the company. And so I do still write code. Sometimes I write code when it's really important for the company in an area that I like, something related to databases or programming languages, which is kind of my sweet spot or area of expertise. But separately from that, I do still code for sometimes a few hours a day, or at least that's what I try to do. Mostly because I really love coding, and I have been trying to follow the advice that people have given not me specifically, but just generally, like as you become a manager, you should stop coding. If you become a founder, you should stop coding. I keep trying to do that, and I can't. I just really love doing it.
Yeah, that's great. I've heard of yeah, I also heard of a lot of rumors that when you go to management level or you are CEO, then you don't have to code and just hire people to code or let your
Yeah.
CTO code. But yeah, it's really great to hear that you still code for at your own startup now. Yeah. So for Empirical on it's a machine learning company, and it works on the data with machine learning algorithms and try to like using artificial intelligence to help users. And we've seen a lot of startups that are AI based or machine learning based, but most of them didn't really how to say, like, succeed eventually. How do you see this trend?
Well, I'd say that it's really, really, really hard to build a machine learning startup. And I think that's because machine learning software doesn't behave like traditional software. And I'll explain that in a second. But if you look at like public market companies, the ones that successfully use machine learning today are consumer companies. And I think that's because the UI that consumer companies are able to expose that machine learning powers is one that's really simple and easy and can just be accelerated by machine learning. So I think Google search is a great example of that. There's machine learning ranking which search results come in what order. But if the search results come in an order that's not exactly what you wanted them to be, then as a user, you don't really realize that. And it's not the end of the world. Similarly, I think TikTok is a really cool example. The machine learning model tries to predict what's the video you're going to like the most next. But if it picks, one that you didn't have in mind, it's not something that you would be necessarily upset about. In the business world, especially in the data world, users are trained to expect exact things. So, for example, in the world of business intelligence and analytics, users, if they're aggregating like sales results for the past quarter, they want to know the exact number. They don't want to know a guess of what sales will be. And actually, maybe surprising or unsurprisingly, if you try to forecast what sales will be in the next quarter, people get pretty upset if it's not accurate. And so it's a lot harder to do. And the other thing is that, and this is like, I'm going to get really technical for a second, but in consumer applications, the schema for every consumer is the same. And it's really hard to write code or build software that works on multiple schemas at once. But if the schema is the same, then you can kind of train a model that works across a number of different use cases and users. In the enterprise world, everyone's schema is a little bit different. So for example, one person might be forecasting sales and another person might be forecasting clicks, or another person might be trying to calculate how many in-person sales will happen, and a different person might be trying to calculate how many online sales will happen. And you can imagine the differences in the data and therefore the differences in the model that you have to produce. And so the challenge in machine learning becomes if you produce a product that requires handholding and it's very easy to fall into the trap that does, then your engineers are going to be training and improving the machine learning model for every customer that you acquire. And that is a recipe to build a consulting company, not a software company. So that's one of the big things we learned at Impira. It's one of the things that we've also seen make a number of our competitors and peers that are building machine learning companies struggle. And when we really doubled down on document processing and data extraction, we kind of drew a line in the sand and said we are 100% committed to making our product self-service, which kind of forces us to avoid that problem. So it's a very hard technical problem to make a machine learning company scalable like any other software company, but I think it can be done.
Got it. So it's like the difficulty in the generalizations and to scale up.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
it's very hard to generalize. Yeah.
yeah. So to ease that difficulty, what we did is we kind of narrow down the domain that we work on, right? To focus on very clearly defined topics and problems. And then we will be able to achieve good results on this.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of, so one, you definitely have to narrow the problem down enough that, you know, uh, maybe I would zoom out and say, like, what you want to avoid is a scenario where to acquire the N plus first customer, you have to have your software engineers train or update the model to support the customer. A very, very common flavor of machine learning company that struggles is one that tries to, let's just use something fictional like forecast sales. So let's imagine that you go and sell software to a company that, you know, has a certain, there are certain drivers for their business, they have a certain financial model, et cetera, et cetera. You inhale all that data and build a model that tells them what their sales will be. You do a great job. And then you sell it to the next customer, and there's the data that actually tells you how their sales will perform is different. And so you need to, train a new model to actually be able to do that. If your engineers have to train a model, then you're toast, because you've ended up building a consulting company, not a software company. So one part of that is narrowing the problem down enough so that you don't need to train a new model every time. So in the fictional example that I gave, the difference between a direct sales company and a consumer e-commerce company is probably really big, but the difference between two e-commerce companies is a lot smaller. And so it could be the case that if you narrow the problem down to just looking at e-commerce companies, the model that you train for, the first N customers might actually generalize better to the N plus first. Another thing you can do, which is what we do a lot of at Impira, is actually treat the machine learning problem more like a compiler problem. So under the hood, Impira actually compiles a new model for every customer, and the models that we develop can train with very small amounts of data. And so that's a different approach that happens to work really well for the problem of extracting data from documents, but it may not work for every problem. So that there are a few different ways to skin the cat, but at the end of the day, what you have to do is figure out a way to generalize the work that you do for some customers to the next.
Okay, got it. Do you think at some point, I mean, do you think at some point we will broaden the broaden our field so that we could do more instead of narrowing down? I mean, at first we narrow down just to have a solid stand, but at what time or when would you expect it to grow and to have more ability of generalization?
Yeah, so I think there are two factors that drive that type of generalization. The first one is just more talent that understands machine learning. So if you imagine if you imagine software that doesn't necessarily need to generalize because your customer is able to train their own model or add parameters or even tweak your software themselves to be able to work on their data, because they understand how machine learning works, or even they have some good statistical intuitions around their data. That's one factor that makes a big difference. And I think there's some companies like Databricks, for example, that have grown astronomically. Alteryx is another great example of a company that's grown astronomically against that trend, because so many more people are learning how to analyze and manipulate data. So that's one way. And the other thing is technology. I think neural networks are great, but they're very, 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 very primitive. You're basically trading, any specialization for a particular problem with producing gigantic amounts of training data, which have to be pretty accurately labeled. And that task is incredibly expensive and difficult to do. Only a few can afford to actually do it well. However, a lot of machine learning is evolving and advancing so that you don't need so much data to be able to train a model for a particular task. And that's one part research and another part people just engineering and writing code, so that there are more machine learning models out there that are more specific to particular tasks. And I think these two trends in concert are making machine learning a lot more accessible for a lot more problems. But it's not going to happen overnight. In 2017, when I was starting Impira, I thought, by 2018, all of this stuff would be solved. And here we are 4 years later, and we're still in the very early innings of it.
Yeah, definitely. I like your ambitious in 2013. Many researchers had the same thoughts, but yeah. Yeah, and also I remember the examples you gave, like for like Google search results and TikTok personalized recommendations. People are used to it because they didn't expect a specific answer, and
right.
And they're not the goal of their algorithm is not to show exact things, right? And so that makes it feel like it's so model advances are important, but it's also important to frame the problem and to set up the user's expectations. So does that also give you some thoughts when you start a machine learning company?
Oh yeah, no, I wrote a blog post a few years ago about how basically all of the UIs that we're used to using to manipulate data have to change in the world of machine learning, because the information that you get when you're using Excel or Tableau or Power BI or Salesforce, they're all deterministic. Like all the information that you see on the screen is exact, and that's what people are used to. But in the machine learning world, all the information carries some uncertainty. And so, if you're showing a bar graph, how do you represent uncertainty in a bar graph in a way that someone without a PhD can understand? It's not an easy problem to solve. And just to give you an example, in Impira, unlike Google or TikTok, we're actually giving people a very exact piece of information. They upload an invoice into Impira and they want to know exactly what the total is and what the invoice number is and when it's due. But the way that we communicate that uncertainty is by using something really simple. If we're very certain about the information, then we have a little green bar next to the data. And if we're uncertain, then we have an orange bar. And that actually helps users sift through what they need to review and not. And we have a number of pieces of the user experience that actually help people understand that. And the cool thing is, this is kind of a hard technical problem too, but it's doable. In Impira, every time you change something, like if you find an orange cell and you correct the value or confirm that it's already correct, you actually teach the model as you're doing that. And so that makes it really fun for users to actually go and put in the time and energy to review things that they see and improve them and actually improve the model in the process.
Got it. Yeah. So that, yeah. So I feel like why so that makes me feel like it's very important to help users interpret your results.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah. Even though you're showing the exact things like the numbers and the text you parse or you recognize from what they upload, but you also have the confidence signal that you show them and help them process the information that you provide.
Yeah, design is a very, very big part of what we do at Impira, both everything from our website to every little piece of the product experience. We think, or at least strive to think about with design first, because it's so important. I mean, users who are using machine learning software like Impira have, they're learning a bunch of these concepts for the first time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I've also seen some of our audiences are still in school, and they are and some of them are still in their junior stage in their career, just like me. Uh, so so for people that started their career or they're junior in their career life, are there, and we often have some questions when we make choices. For example, what would be how what factors should we consider when we choose our first job after graduation? You
Yeah.
say you dropped out and you joined a startup, you start your startup. Have you ever thought about joining a big company, a giant tech such as Google, Facebook as a first job?
Yeah. I actually interned at Microsoft, and my first day, I'm Indian by background, and I'm sure other Indians or people from similar backgrounds can relate to. My parents basically dictated that I should either get a PhD or work at Microsoft or Google. And in their mind, there was no other option. So I interned at Microsoft, and my manager's manager did like a one-on-one with me the first day or the first week, and he had a PhD. So this guy was like the coolest person in the world, and he is really cool, and really nice. And I asked him this question, and he gave me incredibly good advice, which is, um, if you don't know what you want to do, stay in school, because it's the best way to learn about what you want to do with your life. And that could be anything from, like, if you're an undergrad and you're still trying to figure out what parts of CS you really like, you should stay in undergrad, because you're not going to be able to take 4 or 5 classes in different fields or have that much exposure to different kinds of computer science in any job that you have. Similarly, if you graduate from undergrad, you're still trying to learn about what you want to do a master's or do a PhD and learn more about different areas in a way that exposes you to um, a lot of different things. If you have a decent idea of what you want to do, then work at a large company, and try to specialize in an area of some interest to you in a large company. And if you know exactly what you want to do, then work at a startup, because there's no better way to really focus on one thing and get exceptionally good at it with exceptionally great people. Um, Now, I ended up following his advice and trying to do research, and then getting bored, and then ultimately sort of finding my heart in startups. But I've talked to a lot of candidates and people over the past 10 years or so that I've been working on stuff. And I think the most important first question to ask is actually, what level of risk are you comfortable taking as an individual? Do you have student debt? Do you does your family or parents or lifestyle dictate a certain kind of um, reliability in salary or something like that? Do you have kids? Right? These are all really important factors, and I think the first thing you should do is try to calculate, what does a minimum viable salary look like for me, and really think about what that is. And for a lot of people, it's surprisingly low, and for others, it's surprisingly high. And I think that is an incredibly important filter. If you find that it's too high to work at a startup, then now is not the right time to work at a startup. If you find that it's low enough that you have multiple options, then it's time to think about what do you really want to learn. And I think if you're passionate about technology, or you're passionate about people, or you're passionate about the particular mission that a company might have, there's no better way to learn a ton than to work at a startup.
Got it. And you mentioned that if we are confused and don't know what to do, stay in school. But what would you recommend us to? What ways would you recommend for us to help us think through what I want to do?
Yeah. Well, school can only last for so long too, right? But while you're in school, I think often we think about school as an opportunity to get good grades, but the best people that I know now are people that used school as an opportunity to learn about themselves. So take the hardest classes that you can in the areas that interest you, and don't worry about grades, or at least don't use that as a factor to decide what classes to take. So if I were in school right now, I would take, the really hard machine learning classes and the really hard systems classes, the really hard algorithms classes, the really hard distributed systems classes, just to expose myself to these different areas and try to test where my passions are. Once you discover what your passion is, for me, I was fortunate. I realized it was systems pretty early. But once you sort of have that moment where you figure out what your passion is, then a lot of the steps become much clearer. And school, I think, is the best way to really test and learn about that for yourself.
Got it. So it's like you test and explore, and at school, taking all different classes and to see what interests you and what you like the most.
Yeah. And if you run out of time, then, you can either make an educated guess and work at a startup and like really get into that particular area. Like, for example, if you realize, or if you have a strong sense that machine learning is your thing, you're going to learn a lot more about machine learning at a startup like Impira, or another startup that works on machine learning, than you will at a big company. It's just because, of the pace and intensity at a startup. Obviously, you have to find one that has good people that you can learn from, but it's going to be a much more intense and I'd say advanced learning environment. On the other hand, if you don't feel ready to make an educated guess like that, then a big company is a good way to have exposure to a number of different fields and kind of buy yourself some time as well.
Got it. So for people that already left school, just like me, what would you suggest that to try and test and explore now?
I would try to talk to as many people as you can. I'll shamelessly promote my fiance Alana's new venture fund called Base Case, which we started together, and she now is full-time running, where we invest in really early stage companies in data and machine learning. And she has a community where these companies meet with people that are still in, jobs at Google or Airbnb or other pretty large companies, but they just want to meet founders who are working on different kinds of problems, and maybe offer some help, maybe eventually work with them, or maybe just learn about different areas and get some exposure. So if anyone is interested in that, definitely reach out to me. But I would say in general, like, try to meet as many people as you can and talk to them and see if you can get your heart fluttering and excited about something. And that, in my experience, at least, if you can find something that just ignites your passion, then you should do it. And until you do, the task is just meeting as many people, trying as many things as you can, work on an open source code base in an area that interests you and see if you like it. You may not, and then don't, but you may. And the power of passion, once you find it, is just incredible.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, thanks for offering your wife's company. But besides that, where do you think we can find people that we should talk about if we have a small social network? How do we stretch out? How do we reach out to other talents?
Well, I think the other thing I'll shamelessly promote is CMU TNE. I think it's a great community of people who, I will talk to anyone from CMU and anyone on this call who wants to learn about Impira, or say, hey, my interest is this other kind of company. Ankur, do you know any founders that are working on this kind of problem that I can talk to? But take advantage of the communities that you have access to. And by the way, everyone on this call, CMU is a great school, and pretty much anyone is happy to talk to you because the opportunity to work with you is probably valuable for that person. So don't undersell yourself. Like, people are really generally excited to talk to bright, young, full of ideas people, and I think you might be surprised by how quickly your social network can grow, just based on the community that you already have.
Thank you. I mean, I have to clarify, this part has not been rehearsed. Yeah, so as we have like around 50 minutes left, probably we can go to the Slido and answer the questions our audiences have. So can you see the Slido page, Ankur?
I can, yeah. I just pulled it up, yeah.
Okay, great. So the first question is from Samuel. He asked, who were your first customer and how did you source for them?
Yeah, so our first two customers were a company called Goop, which is Gwyneth Paltrow's e-commerce company, and StitchFix, which is another e-commerce company. And right after starting Impira, I asked all of my friends and our investors and anyone who had talked to me to connect me to anyone who might be interested in what we were doing. And I talked to a bunch of people in a bunch of different industries, and talked to more people. And some people kept talking to us, and some people told me to go away. And if you imagine just grinding and doing that for several months at a time, Goop and StitchFix were two people that just kept talking and had some really exciting use cases for how to use our technology, and were visionaries who saw past the fact that we didn't have a product and didn't really have a team or any customers, but had enough pain that it was actually worth talking to us about how we could help them. And so I think I met them both in February or so of 2018, and they became customers in May and June of that year. And sometimes they ignored me for weeks. Other times we we're talking every day, but throughout the whole experience, I just kept trying to talk to as many people as I could, and kept talking to these people over and over and over again. And ultimately that, led us to opportunities to demo and convince them that taking a bet on us was worth it.
Okay, got it. Very persistent.
Yeah, there's no substitute to that.
Yeah. And the second question from Dan, what was the traction for Impira when you raised the first round? Did you have any paying customers?
Yeah, so actually we had like zero traction. It was just me. I had just come back from a trip, and I made a demo, which I showed some customers who I actually have pre-existing relationships with from MemSQL on the way back from Kenya. You can imagine getting from Nairobi to San Francisco requires stopping in a few places. So I stopped in Munich and New York and showed the demo to some customers that I've worked with before and got their feedback. And that was enough for me to raise. I don't think everyone has that experience. I was fortunate to be an executive at another venture-backed company, have the time to build relationships with people, have a lot of things de-risked, like my ability to recruit people, and the customer relationships that I had, and the ability to build software. And so the formula worked out that some great investors like Lightspeed and General Catalyst were willing to take a bet on me with conviction based on my background and the demo and sort of initial feedback I have. They didn't need a bunch of paying customers to sort of build the same amount of conviction. I'd say, generally speaking, your job when you're fundraising is to try to build enough conviction in your prospective investors that they're willing to take a bet on you. And for every round and every person and every company and every market, that looks a little bit different.
Got it. And by the way, just an add-on question: how did you meet the investors? You said you meet with Lightspeed and the other VC firms.
Yeah. So Lightspeed, there's a guy named Adam Goldberg who used to be a product manager and interviewed at MemSQL like 4 years ago, declined our offer, even though we tried to hire him. And then we stayed in touch, and he ended up joining another company and then joined Lightspeed. And when he joined, we stayed in touch, and he's the one who ultimately connected the dots. He's also a very persistent person, but I will say, like, a lot of the really great people I've met, including other investors in MemSQL, are people that I crossed paths with at some point. They turned me down, or I turned them down for whatever the thing was, and then we stayed in touch. And people do incredible things.
That's amazing. So just have keeping connections with people and connecting the dots someday.
Yeah.
Yeah. And let's go to the next question, also from Dan. Can you tell us a little more about your first hire at Impira? How did you convince some of those early employees to join you on your journey?
Yeah, the answer is like exactly the same as the answer for Samuel. Between July and September, every day of every week, including Saturdays and Sundays, I met with probably 4 or 5 people for coffee, which was not easy. One part of it is just finding people and getting people to introduce me to people, and following up on emails and like doing all of that stuff, and then just meeting a bunch of people and interviewing them and talking to them, understanding what people want. There's a law of large and small numbers as well, sometimes with recruiting people. But it took several months, and actually the first 3 people who joined are all people that I knew, 2 of whom I'd worked with in the past, one of whom I met earlier that year, and then kind of became friends with. And so I probably talked to 100 or 120 people in that few months time span, and ended up recruiting 3 of them to join. But there's no substitute to persistence and hard work and just meeting people.
Sounds very well. I have to admit that it is the persistence and the hard work that, because as I can imagine, the chances are low, and all you can do is to increase the pool.
It's also very, I mean, when I joined MemSQL, we had no brand, but by the time I left, we had a pretty decent recruiting brand. And so I was used to recruiting with our brand and very spoiled. And so I had to, really roll up my sleeves, and I couldn't say, Comcast is our customer, or like all these crazy things I used to. But I would say the other thing, both with recruiting and with customers, is having great mentors is really important. I was fortunate with recruiting, especially, that I had a lot of experience recruiting, and there's no substitute to recruiting constantly. Actually, Kishan had me do a talk, I think a year or 2 ago, about recruiting. And I would just repeat the advice that even if you haven't started a company yet, the most important thing you can do to prepare yourself to start a company is to practice recruiting. Whether that's interviewing or like doing anything your company will let you do to be involved in recruiting is incredibly valuable. But find mentors who can help you with that, and practice as much as you can.
That's very practical advice learned. Yeah. Okay, so next question, also from Samuel. Who were your initial investors, and what was the process like getting them on board?
Yeah, so the first 2 institutional investors were Lightspeed and General Catalyst. I had been talking to Lightspeed for a while, and so they kind of catalyzed the fundraise. I actually met General Catalyst during the fundraise, but the investor and now board member Steve Herod used to be the CTO of VMware, and so there's not a lot of like super technical people in venture capital, but we clicked like immediately, and so it was a kind of like a match made in heaven to work with him. The process, that's probably like a whole nother Zoom call to talk about it, but I'd say while every fundraise is different, this is one that just catalyzed really quickly with a meeting at Lightspeed. I got a term sheet from them, and actually really quickly from a few others, and then kind of had a choice to make in terms of which one to pick. It wasn't a very practiced, methodical fundraise. The next round that we raised was a little bit more practiced and methodical, but it still actually ultimately ended up getting preempted by a venture firm called Cotu. So without getting into the sort of nitty gritty details, I would say that every fundraise is a little bit different. Both of these fundraises were ones that are kind of a long time coming, having built relationships with the sort of target investors, and then ended up moving pretty quickly.
Thanks for sharing. And the next question is anonymous question. Do you have any advice for founders from non-technical or business backgrounds who want to start a company in the ML space?
Yeah, I do. We wrote a blog post for Base Case that actually talks all about this. I can drop a link in the Zoom chat, but it basically talks about how there are three kinds of machine learning companies, and just borrowing the lexicon from that blog post, one of them is called a powered by ML company. And basically these are companies that require a combination of a very deep understanding of a particular problem and a very deep understanding of machine learning. So if you're a non-technical or business user, then what you can really bring to the table with a machine learning company is a deep understanding of a problem that could benefit from machine learning. You're going to have to pair it with someone who has a deep understanding of machine learning technology. And I don't think you could, reasonably start an ML company without an ML co-founder. But assuming you find one, for that ML founder, you might be someone who can actually provide a lot of focus and excitement and interest in a problem that ML person can apply their sort of technical insight into and drive a lot of value. So a really great example of a company like that is a company called Gong, where some of the founders are machine learning folks, and the CEO was a sales leader for a long time. And so he really understands the inefficiencies in a sales organization and how they can be improved by, in their case, watching videos and automatically coaching salespeople based on what happens in videos. So I think that's a great example to study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good to know. And the next question from Dan. What unique challenges did you face as a solo founder raising your first round? How did you overcome them?
So I think venture capitalists are not as opposed to solo founders as you might think. Generally speaking, there's like one CEO, and in some cases, it's actually harder to raise with a group of people because it's unclear who the CEO is, and VCs really like to understand that. But I would say, like everything with fundraising, your job is to create enough conviction in the mind of an investor that they're willing to invest despite the risks. And having multiple founders is a way of de-risking certain things, but it also introduces some risk. The number one cause for startup failure is founder breakups. So in my case, I was able to de-risk the sort of standard challenges of having a solo founder in a highly technical product, which is having experience selling things and having experience building things. I happen to have experience doing both based on what I did at MemSQL. And so that sort of de-risked the need to have multiple founders from the perspective of our investors. So that's kind of how I'd think about it. Based on what your company is and what your background is, what do you need to de-risk by having multiple founders or not?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So, and as we're approaching the time, we have one last question of today. Yeah. So from Himanshu, what is a good stage to pitch to VCs for seed or pre-seed round? What data convinces them of the value proposition, and how to go about reaching out to the right VCs?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question. What data convinces them of the value proposition? No data convinces anyone of the value proposition. Your job is to create enough conviction in the mind of an investor that they're willing to bet on you and the problem that you're solving. Data is an incredibly inefficient way to create conviction, but it does work. The much better ways to create conviction are trust, having a background that de-risks what you're going to work on, assembling a team that de-risks what you're going to work on, charisma and excitement, traction that doesn't necessarily need to be codified in data, like customer references or customer excitement. These are all ways to create excitement in the mind of an investor. Now, again, if you happen to, build Snapchat in your basement and then have like 1 million users or something, yes, sure, you can use that to create conviction as well. But if you're building something that requires, selling software to other companies, it's not likely to be the best way to build, conviction relative to the amount of money that you need to actually build the product that you're trying to. In terms of the right stage, I think there's no stage that's too early to build relationships with investors. And then the better the relationships you build are, and the better your understanding of the market, the better your sort of founder gut will be to know when the right time to raise is. So I would think less about pitching and less about sort of fundraising and more about which investors you want to work with and trying to figure out ways to build relationships with them far in advance of needing to invest. And guess what? Investors know more than any founder about when companies should fundraise because they spend all day thinking about that. You're probably spending all day thinking about your customers and your product and your team. And so if you build good relationships with investors, I think what you'll find more often than not is they'll tell you when it's time for you to raise because they don't want to miss out on the opportunity to invest in you. To go about reaching out to the right VCs, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there's no substitute to talking to people. Reach out to everyone and talk to anyone that wants to talk to you, and you'll start to get a sense of who the right people to talk to are and who you like to work with and not. In terms of like the tier one venture capitalists like Lightspeed or Sequoia or others to talk to, if you find really good pre-seed or seed investors, they'll have relationships with those firms ahead of time. One of the things that we do at Base Case is actually broker the relationships with the right institutional investors, including the aforementioned ones, to our portfolio companies at the right time. Just because Alana is really, really good at doing that and setting up the intro at the right time to the right partners. So I would encourage you to find really good kind of small or solo investors who have a really good set of relationships with larger investors and a good spidey sense for when the right time is to talk to them.
Yeah, so that was the last question for this event. And thank you so much, Ankur, for being here. And all of your insights are super thoughtful. And a lot of the lessons honestly ring true from a lot of founders. And it's just repeated and emphasized again. Wanted to also thank Shinru for being our moderator today. And so rest of you, thank you for coming. And I hope you all have a great rest of your night.
I'll just double down the thank you to Shinru. I think we had a chat beforehand, and I thought you did an exceptional job and really enjoyed both of our conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Ankur, for your patience in answering all these questions, and thanks, Tiffany, for organizing the events, and thank you for all the audiences that stay with us and listening to this event. I really wish we could do this more and have more sharings like this.
Yeah, me too. It was a lot of fun, and I also really enjoyed the questions. And as always, thank you, Tiffany, for organizing.